Good day. Today we're going to examine what may well turn out to be one of the most consequential financial and legal crises facing the European Union since its creation. We're talking about the 40 billion euro loan scheme that was supposed to be funded by frozen Russian assets, a plan that has now run into serious obstacles that reveal fundamental weaknesses, not just in European decision-making, but in the entire Western approach to economic warfare against Russia. Now, before we dive into the current crisis, let me remind you to hit that like button if you find this analysis useful. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these in-depth examinations of the forces shaping our world. The situation we're witnessing today didn't manage in a vacuum. To understand why this 40 billion euro scheme is now falling apart, we need to go back to the beginning of this financial saga. When Western powers first froze Russian assets following the start of the special military operation in Ukraine, the decision was presented as a temporary measure, a way to pressure Russia into changing course. But as I warned at the time, freezing assets is one thing, actually confiscating them is quite another matter entirely. The legal foundation for asset freezing has always been shaky, but it was defensible under certain interpretations of international law during active hostilities. However, the moment Western powers began discussing permanent confiscation, turning these frozen assets into funding for Ukraine, they crossed a line that fundamentally undermines the entire international financial system. What we're seeing now is the inevitable consequence of that decision. The European Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen and pushed forward by figures like German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, initially tried to present this as a sophisticated financial instrument. They weren't stealing Russian money, they claimed they were simply using the interest generated by these assets to fund loans to Ukraine. But as any competent lawyer will tell you, using someone else's property to generate income without their consent is still a form of theft, regardless of how you dress it up in financial jargon. Here's where the story gets really interesting, and why what's happening now was entirely predictable. Belgium, which hosts Euroclear, the institution that actually holds these Russian assets, has suddenly developed cold feet. They're demanding that other EU member states share legal liability for any international court judgments that might arise from this scheme. And guess what? Other European governments are refusing to provide those guarantees. Now, why would Belgium make such a demand? And why would other EU governments be so reluctant to share this liability? The answer is obvious to anyone with legal training. They all know this scheme is illegal under international law. If they truly believed their actions were legally justified, there would be no need for Belgium to demand liability sharing and no reason for other governments to refuse. Let me break down what's really happening here. When the European Commission first proposed this scheme, they commissioned legal experts to find justification for what amounts to asset confiscation. The resulting legal framework is so convoluted, so filled with exceptions and qualifications, that it essentially admits the illegality of the entire enterprise. You don't need such complex justifications for legal actions. The complexity itself is evidence of the legal problems involved. Belgium's position is actually quite rational. Euroclear is based in Belgian territory, which means Belgium bears the primary legal risk if international courts rule against this confiscation scheme. And make no mistake, if this case ever reaches international arbitration, Russia's lawyers will have an absolute field day. The legal precedents are clear. You cannot unilaterally confiscate sovereign assets without due process, regardless of your political disagreements with that sovereign power. What makes this crisis even more damaging is how it's playing out in public. Instead of quietly resolving these legal concerns, we're seeing a very public dispute between Belgium and the European Commission. Every argument, every demand for liability sharing, every refusal to provide guarantees, all of this is being documented and will be available to Russia's legal team if this ever goes to court. France and Italy have now joined Belgium in opposing the scheme, though for slightly different reasons. Both countries have long supported the concept of Eurobonds, joint European debt instruments that would allow highly indebted nations like France and Italy to benefit from Germany's better credit rating. They see this crisis as an opportunity to push for Eurobonds instead of the Russian asset-based loan. This reveals another fundamental problem with European unity on Ukraine policy. When push comes to shove, each nation prioritizes its own financial interests. France and Italy would rather see European taxpayers fund Ukraine through Eurobonds than risk the legal complications of asset confiscation. It's a rational calculation, but it exposes the shallow nature of European solidarity. Germany finds itself in an impossible position. Chancellor Scholz has spent enormous political capital supporting Ukraine, even as his own economy slides deeper into recession. German industrial production is falling, energy costs remain prohibitively high compared to competitors, and public opinion is increasingly skeptical of continued support for Ukraine. Now Scholz must choose between backing a legally dubious asset confiscation scheme or supporting Eurobonds that German taxpayers will ultimately guarantee. The numbers tell a sobering story. The Economist magazine recently calculated that Ukraine needs approximately $360 billion over the next 2 years to maintain its defense capabilities. Even if the €40 billion loan scheme somehow succeeded, it would cover less than half of Ukraine's requirements. This mathematical reality makes the current legal and political crisis even more pointless. They're fighting over a sum that's insufficient anyway. But here's what nobody wants to discuss publicly. Where is all this money actually going? Ukraine's defense spending has reached 23% of Russia's level. Despite having a fraction of Russia's military capabilities, Russia maintains a comprehensive air force, produces vast quantities of guided bombs, operates thousands of drones, maintains a massive missile arsenal, and produces more artillery than the entire collective West. Yet somehow Ukraine's defense spending approaches a quarter of Russia's total military budget. The answer lies in two factors that European officials prefer not to examine too closely. First, Western weapons are phenomenally expensive. When you can only produce limited quantities but throw unlimited money at defense contractors, unit costs inevitably soar. A single Western artillery shell now costs multiples of its Russian equivalent, not because it's necessarily more effective, but because the production constraints create artificial scarcity that drives up prices. Second, and perhaps more importantly, corruption in Ukrainian weapons procurement appears to be reaching astronomical levels. We're seeing reports of Ukrainian officials awarding massive contracts to companies with no military manufacturing experience, no facilities, and no ability to deliver the promised weapons. The Financial Times and Washington Post have documented several such cases, each involving tens of millions of dollars that simply vanished into the international financial system. This corruption dynamic is accelerating as the military situation deteriorates. As I've discussed in previous analyses, the fall of Pokrovsk appears imminent. Russian forces are advancing on multiple fronts, and Ukrainian desertion rates reached record levels in October. When insiders begin to sense the end approaching, the incentive to extract as much money as possible becomes overwhelming. The International Monetary Fund has now indicated it might withhold support for Ukraine if European funding doesn't materialize. This threat reveals another uncomfortable truth. Even the IMF, which has historically been willing to bend its own rules for geopolitical purposes, is becoming nervous about Ukraine's financial stability. If the IMF pulls back, we could see a rapid collapse of the Ukrainian currency and potentially hyperinflation. Ukraine's private creditors are also getting nervous. Despite being offered attractive terms and upfront payments, some are refusing to roll over Ukrainian debt. This suggests they're positioning themselves for potential default proceedings. You don't reject profitable terms unless you believe the borrower won't be around to honour future obligations. The European Commission is now floating Eurobonds as an alternative, but this faces its own political obstacles. German public opinion overwhelmingly opposes jointly guaranteed European debt, as do voters in other creditor nations like the Netherlands, Finland and Slovakia. Scholz might personally support Eurobonds. He's shown no aversion to debt accumulation, but the political costs could be enormous. The Social Democrats might support Eurobonds, as would the Greens. But significant factions within Scholz's own coalition would likely rebel. The Constitutional Court might also intervene, as they have in previous cases involving European debt sharing. Scholz must weigh his Ukraine commitments against the risk of bringing down his own government. What's most striking about this entire crisis is how it reveals the shallow foundations of European support for Ukraine. When the conflict began, European leaders spoke in grand terms about defending democracy and international law. But now, when asked to put their own legal and financial systems at risk, they're backing away. Belgium's demand for liability sharing essentially admits they believe this scheme will face successful legal challenges. Other governments' refusal to provide guarantees confirms they share this assessment. If European leaders truly believed in the legal and moral justification for confiscating Russian assets, they would eagerly share liability for such a righteous cause. Instead, we see a pattern of trying to find ways to support Ukraine without accepting personal or national risk. It's politically convenient to support Ukraine when the costs are borne by taxpayers or hidden in complex financial instruments. It's quite different when government officials must personally sign documents accepting legal liability for asset confiscation. The timing of this crisis couldn't be worse for Ukraine. Military pressures are mounting on multiple fronts. The Trump administration has shown little enthusiasm for continued massive support, and now European funding mechanisms are breaking down. The very complexity of European decision-making processes, which was supposed to ensure careful consideration of all options, is now preventing rapid response to urgent needs. This crisis also reveals fundamental problems with the West's approach to economic warfare. Freezing assets as a temporary measure during active conflict might be justifiable, but transforming economic sanctions into permanent confiscation creates precedents that will inevitably be used against Western assets in the future. China, in particular, is watching these proceedings very carefully. If the West can confiscate Russia's sovereign assets based on political disagreements, what prevents other powers from doing the same to Western assets? The United States and European nations have substantial investments and financial instruments in emerging markets around the world, setting a precedent for politically motivated asset confiscation essentially gives hostile governments a roadmap for retaliating against Western economic interests. The legal implications extend far beyond the immediate Ukraine situation. International law governing sovereign assets exists precisely to prevent the kind of tit-for-tat confiscation that could rapidly spiral out of control. Once that framework breaks down, we enter a world where economic relationships become purely transactional and temporary, a world where long-term investment becomes impossible because property rights depend entirely on political relationships. Russian officials have been remarkably restrained in their response to this asset confiscation scheme, but that restraint shouldn't be mistaken for acceptance. Russia has substantial legal resources and is already preparing comprehensive challenges in multiple international forums. More importantly, Russia and its allies are developing alternative financial systems precisely to insulate themselves from Western economic warfare. The BRICS nations are accelerating development of alternative payment systems, trade settlement mechanisms, and reserve currencies. The Western confiscation of Russian assets provides powerful justification for these alternatives and encourages other nations that reduce their exposure to Western financial institutions. In the long run, this could prove far more damaging to Western financial dominance than any short-term benefit derived from confiscated Russian assets. What we're witnessing is a classic case of tactical thinking overwhelming strategic considerations. European leaders focused so intensely on finding ways to fund Ukraine that they ignored the broader implications of their methods. They prioritized immediate financial needs over long-term legal and economic stability. The current crisis represents a moment of reckoning. European governments must now choose between accepting legal liability for asset confiscation, finding alternative funding mechanisms, or admitting that their support for Ukraine has practical limits. Each option carries significant political and financial costs. If they proceed with the asset confiscation despite legal objections, they risk devastating court judgments and the collapse of international law governing financial institutions. If they choose Eurobonds, they face massive public opposition and potential government instability. If they scale back support for Ukraine, they must explain why their previous commitments were unrealistic. The irony is that this entire crisis might have been avoidable with more honest assessment of legal and financial realities, rather than trying to circumvent international law through complex financial engineering. European leaders could have simply acknowledged that supporting Ukraine would require direct taxpayer contributions and sought democratic mandates for such expenditure. Instead, they chose to pursue a scheme that everybody privately knew was legally questionable, hoping to avoid political accountability for the real costs of their Ukraine policy. Now they face a crisis that's simultaneously legal, financial, and political, a perfect storm that threatens to undermine everything they've tried to accomplish. But let me be clear about what this crisis really represents. This isn't just about 140 billion euros or even about supporting Ukraine. This is about whether the Western financial system can maintain credibility when it abandons the legal principles that made it dominant in the first place. When you build a global financial architecture on the promise of property rights and legal certainty, then casually abandon those principles for political convenience, you undermine the entire foundation of your own power. China understands this perfectly. Beijing is watching European leaders tie themselves in legal knots over Russian assets while simultaneously developing alternative systems that don't depend on Western financial institutions. Every day this crisis drags on. Every public argument about liability sharing, every admission that the scheme might be illegal, all of this strengthens the case for BRICS nations to accelerate their departure from Western financial systems. The most frustrating aspect of this entire debacle is how preventable it was There were numerous voices, including my own, warning about these exact problems when asset confiscation was first proposed. But European leaders were so focused on appearing tough on Russia that they ignored fundamental legal realities. I remember the early discussions about this scheme, and the legal concerns were obvious from the beginning. The European Commission's own legal advisors raised red flags but were overruled by political consideration. Now, those same legal problems are bringing down the entire edifice exactly as predicted. What's particularly striking is how this crisis reveals the fundamental weakness of consensus-based decision-making when facing real pressures. The European Union prides itself on careful deliberation and unanimous agreement, but that same process that works reasonably well for routine matters becomes paralysis when rapid decisions are needed. Belgium's demands for liability sharing aren't unreasonable. They're actually the rational response of a government that understands legal realities. But the fact that other governments won't provide those guarantees exposes the fundamental dishonesty underlying this entire scheme. Everyone knows it's legally problematic, but nobody wants to admit it publicly. Now they face a choice between bad options and worse options. They can proceed with confiscation and face devastating court judgments. They can pursue Eurobonds and risk political upheaval in Germany and other creditor nations, or they can admit their scheme was flawed and watch Ukraine's funding crisis deepen. The next few weeks will likely determine not just the fate of this particular scheme, but the broader trajectory of European involvement in the Ukraine. What's already clear is that the easy options have been exhausted. European leaders can no longer pretend that supporting Ukraine can be done without serious costs to their own legal, financial, and political systems. The irony is rich. In trying to avoid the political costs of honestly funding Ukraine, European leaders may have created a crisis that's far more damaging than direct taxpayer funding would have been. They prioritized short-term political convenience over long-term strategic coherence, and now they're paying the price. As I've said before in these analyses, international relations ultimately comes down to credibility and capability. This crisis damages both European credibility and European financial capability simultaneously. That's not just bad for Ukraine, it's bad for Europe's entire position in global affairs. The European Union was built on the premise that legal frameworks and institutional processes could transcend raw power politics. The current crisis reveals how quickly those high-minded principles collapse when faced with serious pressures. It's a sobering reminder that in international affairs, you're only as strong as your willingness to accept the consequences of your actions. Thank you for watching this analysis. The situation continues to evolve rapidly, so please subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay updated on these critical developments. Your engagement helps us continue providing this kind of in-depth coverage of the forces shaping our world.